following interview with Alan Price Daw by William Burr took place in San Francisco, California on July 2nd, 1988. The interview is part of a joint effort by the Columbia University World History Research Office and the Foundation for Iranian Studies. Mr. Daw, can you tell me where you were born and raised?
Born in Salt Lake City in 1930, lived there 4 years, 7 years in Portland, Oregon, then Cincinnati, Ohio, graduated from high school in 47, and then really never went home again. College at the College of Worcester, major in geology and political science, 3 years in the Army, some of it in Europe, and then to the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy for 2.5 years, and then down to Washington.
When were you in the Army?
What was it, 51 to 54.
Mm-hmm. And were you in Europe?
The last year and a half in Europe.
Yeah. What were your duties in the Army?
Well, I was a second lieutenant, which means that you are all things to all men. I worked in a counterintelligence corps office in West Germany at a time when the Soviets were quite active in that part of the world.
And then, from the Army, you went back to Fletcher, or you went right to?
Went back to Fletcher directly out of the Army. Spent 2.5 years there.
Okay. And you studied
international law, economics, political theory, diplomatic history.
Okay. And then you went to Washington from there?
Directly.
And you were with which agency?
I was with the agency until 71 when I came back to the United States from Iran.
Now, how did you come to join the agency?
My brother-in-law happened to be, had a number of friends in the agency. I met them. I had planned to go in the Department of State. I had a love of my life who was in state at the time. And through her met a lot of people in the Department of State while I was finishing up at Fletcher. And frankly, I found people in state more concerned with their appearance and their impression on people than they were of the substance of foreign affairs. That rather turned me off. And when a recruiter called me from the agency, I said, yeah, I'll talk with you. I found it interesting. I talked to a number of other people and decided that was where things were being done, and I liked the attitude and intensity of the people involved, and decided that the agency was a much more interesting place to work in the State Department.
What kind of training did you receive when you joined?
Well, the normal, the whole gamut of what one is supposed to know about how one goes about getting other government secrets.
Okay. And what were your first assignments in the years before you ended up in Tehran?
Well, I was in Khartoum for a couple of years, garden spot of the world. Then I was in Afghanistan, 3 years in Kabul. A couple of years, well, 1 year in Karachi, 2 years in Islamabad, and then Tehran.
What were your general range of duties?
Oh, the whole gamut. I did economic work and political work and a little consular work on the side. I was not a consular officer, but I did some work simply subbing for others.
But you did economic and political reporting?
Yes.
Okay. Now, how was it that you were assigned to the station in Tehran?
Well, I really couldn't tell you that. I was given an option, and that was one of the options, and I took it.
Yeah.
I spoke some Persian, having been in Kabul, since that's a Persian-speaking country as well. So I presume it was a logical extension of a tour in Kabul.
Oh, okay. Interesting. What was your range of duties? What kind of duties did you have when you were in Tehran?
Well, the range of duties of any political officer. the object being to represent the United States there, reflect American policy and American interests and the nature of the American society on the one hand, and to interpret the same kinds of things to the U.S. government in respect both to the Iranians and to the other third country governments represented there.
So you did most of it internal reporting?
Sure. Internal and external. I mean, Tehran was the center for a great many foreign governments at the time who had representation in various forms. The Israelis, for example, had a mission. It was and remains a very critically important country for a lot of reasons, geopolitically and oil and the Gulf and the whole set of issues that surround that part of the world. And a lot of governments saw it in those terms and had substantial missions there. So our interests were certainly more than just Iranian politics, economics, sociology, and so forth. They involved also interest in the attitudes and policies of other governments toward us, toward Iran, toward the region.
Now, was the station chief then, was that Alan Conway? Or was that, had he already left?
No, I don't, he was not there when I was there.
Yeah.
I don't know that he was station chief.
I'm not quite sure myself, but that's the impression I got. But was Arthur Callahan then, or Brunel? I'm not quite sure about the order.
Let's stay off that kind of thing, if you don't mind.
Fine. Now, well, just maybe in terms of generalities, how much interaction did the station chiefs at that period have with the Shah? Did they meet with him pretty routinely on a fairly close basis?
Well, I don't really know, because that was not part of my brief. Okay. That was not part of my area.
You didn't pick up that kind of information when you were there. Okay. I've read that generally the agency had about 10 or so officers in Iran in any given period during the 60s or 70s. Is that pretty much true in numbers, or?
Well, again, I don't really want to go into that.
Okay.
That is not something that I feel free to discuss.
Okay, fine. Now you arrived in I guess, was it late? What year did you arrive in Iran?
68.
Do you recall the months or the season?
September.
So this is towards the close of the Johnson administration. How would you describe the general approach that the administration took towards the Shah in Iran around this stage of things, around this time?
Well, I think if you're talking about the White House or American policy as such, the successive ambassadors, Armin Meyer and Douglas MacArthur II, I think really believed their speeches that this was the island of tranquility in a sea of troubles. This was our great Middle Eastern ally. This was a bastion of Western interest, something to support, something to nurture, care for. There were other views in terms both of the ideal government that could have existed in Iran and in terms of the durability, stability of the Shah's government as such. But the basic position of the United States government, that is, as a policy, was that the Shah, well, it wasn't that he could do no wrong, that he was certainly the best thing that anyone could see there, and from the way they looked at it, he was stable. His government was durable. It represented a good, close working ally in a very dangerous part of the world. So I don't think anyone seriously contemplated an alternative to the Shah in terms of support by the United States.
Now, of course, Nixon comes in several months later. Would you say there's pretty much was a strong continuity from Johnson to Nixon?
I think there was strong continuity from, I think, the time that the Brits and the Americans worked together to put the Shah back in power. I don't think there was any deviation from that of any significance through all those years until 79. I think I might say the Carter policy tended to be more critical of the negative aspects of the Shah's government than any of his predecessors. But even there was no serious question about American support for the Shah and his government. There was question about some of the activities of the government, some of the weak aspects of the government, and this was very much part of Jimmy Carter's human rights, reflection of his views on human rights spread on an international canvas. But was he going to withdraw American support if this or if that? Absolutely not.
Without going into names or the question of numbers, which I asked earlier, I've read that in general the CIA, the station in Iran, mostly focused on the question of Soviet role in the country, Soviet agents and so forth. And that was the preeminent interest, from what Richard Helms has told me, and what I've read in various books. Is that pretty much a fair characterization?
Yes, I think so. Mm-hmm.
So given the net parameters, how many people actually spent a fair amount of time on Iran as such, internal affairs of Iran?
Well, I think it was a minority, a subsidiary, definitely secondary interest of the U.S. government. It's a classic responsibility, not just of the agency, but of every government institution, to keep abreast to the degree they could of issues like political stability, threats to government, economic problems arising, this kind of economic conditions, for example. But certainly our major concern was the Soviets, and for a lot of very valid historical reasons, which have not yet played out.
Were there any people at the station around the time you were there? You said you had some Farsi, but besides yourself, were there others who spoke Farsi?
Many.
Most
varying degrees of fluency. I certainly was not a fluent Persian speaker. I had not had any formal training in Persian, but I do like languages and picked it up fairly well.
Were any of the officers Iranian specialists as such? Have you had a deep knowledge, background in studying Iran as a society?
There were a number of people, I would say 2 or 3 people in the embassy who could be considered Iranian specialists, both by temperament, personal interest, and training, who were keenly interested in Iran as Iran, Cyrus the Great, etc. A genuine, deep interest in Iranian culture, history, sociology, politics.
Okay.
Were there enough? Isn't that the question?
Yeah.
Hell no, there weren't enough. There never are. It's very expensive to train an officer in a foreign language. And this foreign language, of course, was effective basically in only 2 countries, Iran and Afghanistan, to a certain degree in the Gulf, and other spots. But fundamentally, we had inadequate Persian language capability, inadequate area knowledge. But that's true everywhere. Probably the only place I'm aware of we ever had an intense, deep understanding of a country was Germany, and that was because we had so many people in Germany, we, the U.S. government, after the war, and they liked it and they stayed and they were there for years and years and years. It is difficult to get someone to live in the Middle East over an extended period of time with a family, and so the whole upshot of this is that Persian studies certainly don't produce the number of participants, let's say people who are keenly interested in Iran or Afghanistan, as France or Germany or Britain or Scandinavia. It's very nice living there. It's not terribly nice living in the Middle East, although Iran certainly was a lovely place to live. So we didn't have enough Persian speakers, we didn't have enough area knowledge, and that, now you're talking about the professional level of foreign representation. When you talk about Washington, then of course it's a whole other ballgame. how many people in Washington had 20 minutes for an intense discussion of what was happening in Iran. Vietnam was going on, etc. The U.S. government's considerable problem of handling throwing more than one ball in the air was certainly true there in Iran in that period.
That's interesting. Now, various histories of the U.S. Iran relations, various articles and books talk about the CIA's fairly close relationship with Sabah, the Iranian intelligence agency of this period. How did you evaluate Sabah as an organization?
Well, Sabah was brutal, again in a historical context, and relative to the rest of the Middle East, not particularly brutal. I used to tell some of my friends who were bitterly critical of the Shah's government and of Sabah, and for good reason, that they ought to spend 6 months in Baghdad, or 6 months in Pakistan under Bhutto, or 6 months in Kabul under Daoud, or try the Egyptian Director General of Intelligence. Sabah was brutal. People died in its prisons, no question about that. They had kind of the, what shall I say, the French phrase, the petit fonctionnaire, but armed with political power. They were very, very aggressive and very pompous and very egoistic in the sense that they really had no challenge, legal or otherwise, from anyone. So they had a lot of power. But it is, I think, useful to compare Sabak's activities, whether or not it was ubiquitous as it attempted to portray itself, whether or not it was unusually brutal, horizontally in space and vertically in time. The Persians have never been very gentle with people who were opposed to a sitting government. And the rest of the Middle East was a very, very tough place, considerably tougher, in my view, than Iran. So Sabak has to have a context, historical, relative to other countries, and historical relative, for example, to what the mullahs have done since they've come in. So, bad, yes. As bad as portrayed, not in my view, not from what I had known living in the Middle East.
Well, how able do you think Sabak was as a political intelligence organization?
I'm afraid Sabak partook of what I think a lot of us felt was an Iranian cultural trait, and that is, unlike the Afghans, you'd ask an Afghan what time it was, the classical joke, you'd ask an Afghan what time it was, and he'd say, "Why do you ask?" In Iran, the answer would be, "What time do you want it to be?" That is unfair because the Persians, once comfortable, are much more honest and direct than that. But culturally, in general terms, the Iranians tended to answer in the way they thought you wanted to hear, with whatever it was they thought you wanted them to say. And the implication of that for Sabak was, in my view, that they told the Shah and his government what they thought he wanted to hear. When you have a title of Shah and Shahriyamer, the light of the Aryans, the king of kings, that tends to color what Sabak had to say. So, I don't believe that Sabak was as direct or as honest, and without in any way making an invidious comparison, although I guess they all are. So did the U.S. government in Iran report to Washington generally in terms more favorable to the Shah's government than in fact they should have. One could say, for example, as I think Jim Bill and Dick Cottam and a number of others said, it's not as good as you say, it's not as stable as you say, it is not as open as you say, there are problems here. And really, basically, no one in Washington wanted to hear that. invidious comparison, yes, and I don't mean to carry that too far, but people tend to report whatever they're doing. I'll put it another way, there are very few directly honest people.
I mean, they sort of adopt the party line, whatever it happens to be.
I think so. It's certainly easier, isn't it? Anyway, it's in that sense that I think SAVAK's reporting was skewed.
I'm not sure how much you can go into this, but how closely did the agency work with Savak?
I don't really know. I don't really know. That was not part of my brief. And my understanding is that SAVAK had a great deal of suspicion of the Americans. After all, we seemed unable to keep ourselves from saying, look how wonderful are we can put a government in and take a government out at will. And I think that concerned them. They are also a very, very proud people, borders on arrogance. But for good reason. You know, a terribly impressive cultural history. I would certainly be proud to be an Iranian. I don't. So I think they probably viewed the Americans with considerable suspicion, considerably greater suspicion than the Americans thought they were viewed. I can remember an ambassador getting up and giving an address to some newly arrived embassy employees, in effect saying the Shah and I, or I and the Shah. We had our own problems with arrogance. We still do. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's very interesting. And what you're saying, it sounds like the agency, there was pretty much strong compartmentalization of functions within the station, that there wasn't a lot of, you say within your confines of your assignment, you didn't really learn about what was going on.
No, I don't think that's true.
No,
I think that it is understandable to you, I'm sure, that if I were intimately aware of relationships between the U.S. government and SAVAK, I probably wouldn't discuss them in any depth. So I think, anyway, your question is relations with SAVAK.
Yeah.
I think our relations with SAVAK were probably paralleled by our governmental-to-government relations, in that we thought they loved us, so to speak, or however one would put that, when in fact it was far from the case. And I think the people who worked directly with SAVAK knew that. I think the rest, who had managerial or policy responsibilities, perhaps did not know that at any usable depth. There's a difference between knowing and knowing. That is, knowing as a fact, a stream of information, and knowing as a reality. That is the meaning of it and the implications of it. And I think we chose, as a government, to know things, but to back away from their meanings when they were unpleasant, or maybe unpleasant isn't the right word. The U.S. government has one hell of a time, I presume it's common to all governments, the U.S. government has one hell of a time accepting, shall we say, harsh realities. Because if you know of them and you accept them as ground truth, that is reality, then you have to do something about it. And doing something about it is always the rub. So that if the U.S. government accepted as a reality that the Shah's government had elements of corruption, that members of his family were involved in genuinely nefarious activities, that the intellectual group, the universities, say, in general terms, were opposed to an autocratic government, that the Shah's sister was involved in prostitution or dope or kickbacks from the various merchants in town. If they really accepted that as a reality, then presumably they would have had to do something about it. If they felt the Shah's government was unstable, they would have had to do something about it. What would you have done? And this is always the rub. It is not that there is a problem. Everybody knows there's a problem at one level or another. The question is, how serious is that problem? And if it's serious, what are you going to do about it in the context of all your other interests in Iran? Okay?
Very interesting.
Comes out along that line. And that's true everywhere, isn't it? What are we going to do about Haiti? What are we going to do about Panama? What are we going to do about Brazil shipping arms to Iraq? What are we going to do about the Chinese sending missiles to Iran? Everybody knows about it, but what are you going to do about it?
Interesting. Now, some have argued that during the course of the 1960s, Israeli intelligence organization, Mossad, became relatively influential, or became more influential with Sabat than the CIA. The CIA had been to say during the 1950s. To what extent was that true?
Oh, I have no idea what Mossad's influence was.
Yeah.
There was a very impressive group of Israelis in Iran. They had a number of different functions. They were not officially recognized as a mission, obviously. But basically, throughout the Middle East, at least in my experience, my view, my opinion, the difference between the Israelis and the Americans was that for the Israelis they viewed it as life and death. For us, we viewed it as this invulnerable bastion of democracy with economic leadership of the free world and all those phrases that go with it. And if we win, we win. If we lose, we lose. There was a great difference in the levels of intensity and concern. In the intelligence field, that makes a great difference. In the governmental field, that makes a great difference. Right? So, yes, I think the Israelis had significant influence. They had a very impressive group of people there. Very impressive, one individual by individual. And in the same sense that the Israelis will go after a terrorist, as they did in North Africa a few months ago. You know what would happen if we did that. And the U.S. Congress would absolutely explode, because here we were going out and assassinating people, even though those people had either had or were about to assassinate American officials, for example. We just played a game by different rules. You're not Mike Tyson. If you've grown up in his neighborhood and lived his life, perhaps you would be. It's that kind of difference.
Okay. When you were stationed in Tehran, what kind of did you develop personal contacts and professional contacts with various Iranian citizens, Iranian nationals?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Why not?
Yeah. Well, can you talk about some of the people that you got to know, or in the government, or what
I knew
what
quite a
views
wide
were?
spectrum of people, of various walks of life. I found, these generalizations. Those who worked in the government towed the government line for the most part. There were a very few who were outspoken in terms of criticizing elements of the Shah's administration, which were vulnerable, about which reasonable criticism could be made. There were very few of those. That doesn't mean that there were not Persians in the administration who were critical of it, but they were not actively and vocally critical of it. In terms of those who opposed the government, everything considered, overall this government should be changed. They were very careful what they said. Sadat was a reality. It was something of a bugaboo, but also certainly a reality. And they were very careful what they said, but were critical. And the more you knew them, and the more they came to the point where they believed that they were safe in expressing their honest views, the more critical they became. That also is true of some of the people in the government, but less so, for obvious reasons.
Can you mention any names here? Some of those who had...
No, I don't think I do.
Now, of your Iranian contacts that you developed when you're in Tehran, were many of them from the old nationalist opposition?
Yes,
Yeah.
a number of them. A good number of them.
They pretty much abandoned any political activity as such.
No, they maintained their liaison with their colleagues, their fellows. Those who were, how to put this, those who were actively engaged in the process of overthrowing the Shah's government, or replacing it, overthrowing is perhaps too strong a verb, but wished a different government and were working toward that end, really wanted very little to do with the Americans for pretty obvious reasons. They constituted the major support to the Shah's government, and it would take quite an act of faith to sustain a relationship with an American. The Shah did not relish the idea of Americans maintaining contact with opposition figures. My personal view is that it is ludicrous for the U.S. government to go into a country and accept a denial of contact with anybody in the country we wish to talk to, under any circumstances, other than clandestine or that kind of thing, covert. I think the U.S. government is demented in going into a country and accepting a ruler's order that you not be in touch with this person or that group. And any ambassador who accepts that ought to be pulled out at least that day, if not earlier. However, we did accept that. We do accept that all over the world. We still do, to too great a degree, in my view. Because the world doesn't consist of sitting governments. The world consists of sitting governments who will not be sitting long. At least that's the history of the last 30, 40 years, or probably the last 3,000 or 4,000. Okay? In other words, we don't seem willing to run significant risks. There was a group of Americans at Iran Zamin, the joint Iran-American Cultural Center, who I think were the only people in the U.S. establishment in Iran who consistently, kind of under the guise of culture and reading and so forth, developed truly wonderful contacts and friendships within the Iranians. They did not have an intelligence role or a political role, and perhaps that made it easier, or made it possible. But by and large, all over the world, if a government says you will not have consistent, sustained contact with opposition figures, the Americans rolled over and said, yes, sir, and I think that is insane.
Now, were there orders in the Shah, or was it more a tacit understanding that this would be the case?
I don't know that.
Yeah.
It was very obvious that the embassy was very nervous about anyone who established and maintained contacts with the opposition, because obviously it had been expressed, well, maybe we shouldn't do that.
Were you encouraged to pursue those kinds of contacts, or was it just something you were just free to do on your own?
That was part of my responsibility. It was also certainly part of my interest. I learned several languages, and when I was overseas, to the degree humanly possible, spent as much time with various people in a country as possible. And I frankly, and a number of the people in the embassy did, but in whatever capacity, that was always kind of a thin ice business. It was not particularly welcomed, although the understanding that flowed from that was welcome.
So you would prepare reports pretty routinely on your discussions.
That's what we're there for.
Yeah.
That's what a report is. But again, if you spend an evening with an Iranian or a group of Iranians or anyone in an intense, serious discussion of a number of things, how long would your report be? 50 pages? 100 pages? 200 pages? No, a couple of pages. So there's a great distillation process that takes place, isn't it? Has to.
Yeah.
If you were writing a paper based on an interview with me that ran 4 days, how long would it be? Back to the issue of transcripts.
Yeah, exactly. What was your impression of the extent of the opposition to the Shah at this stage, in the late 60s, early 70s? Based on your contacts with various personalities in the government, outside the government?
Well, there was enough raw material lying around, enough people and groups who were opposed to the Shah's policies or his monopoly of power, which is also very much part of the Persian game, so that when the mullahs, the ulama, pulled themselves together, and when Khomeini gave them leadership, said the king has no clothes, a lot of people jumped on that bandwagon. They had been, their attitudes toward the Shah's government were negative, critical, either on a personal or generic basis. There were a lot of flaws, a lot of things to criticize. The tremendous dislocation of population that occurred in Iran, with the countryside moving into Tehran. You know, compare Kabul, compare Cairo, compare Damascus. It's happening all over the third world. The cities are drowning in unskilled people. That was a source of great perturbation, unhappiness, poverty. And those people, more than any other group in the country, were susceptible to the influence and outspoken criticism by the ulama. Specifically Khomeini, but many, many others. There was a running feud between the government and the mullahs as such. There were a few tame mullahs. But by and large, the leadership of the religious groups were opposed to the Shah on religious and secular grounds. I don't think it is unimportant that Khomeini, for example, was, and Khomeini and others became outspoken critics of the government after the government seized their lands in the land reform period. That represented a real clash. I don't know much about Central or South America, but I would imagine that if the government of X seized the Catholic Church's lands, that this would produce a more strident opposition to that government from the clergy. Okay, so I really wonder sometimes what the degree to which that played a role in the vociferous public criticism of the Shah. You know the theological argument that the Shah is not a legitimate ruler without the blessings of the ulama, and that is very much a Shia tradition and an Iranian tradition that is within the mullah group. It has nothing to do with secular government, and God knows the Shah's government was relatively secular. But the outspoken criticism of the Shah gave those who were unhappy with that government for a variety of reasons grounds for saying, yes, that's right, this government is a mess, it should be replaced. Again, all comparisons are invidious, but you do remember Jimmy Carter's campaign in the United States leading up to this election. Throw the rascals out. Washington's no damn good. What you want is an honest, decent man like me. And the American people said, yes, that's exactly what we want. It turned out that isn't what they wanted, but that's another question. What was it Emerson said? Beware of what you wish, you will get it. Okay, so your question was there opposition? There was a great deal of opposition. But it was in Kuwait and organized, kind of indiscriminate, not necessarily based on reality. That is, again, I used to say to some of my friends, why don't you go to Baghdad for 6 months? Why don't you go to Karachi for 6 months? Go to Kandahar for 6 months? Go to Aleppo for 6 months? Go to Alexandria for 6 months? And then come back and tell me what you think, economically, politically, the issues of repression, so on.
How much did you know about Khomeini and his influence around the time that you were in Iran?
Well, Khomeini was known as the man who pointed the finger, the one who... There were many other prominent clergymen. Gopalgani, Telagani, Maharashi, Bomi to a certain extent, even Shariat Madharan, who yes and no, he was critical but not outspokenly so. Many of the leading religious figures, some of whom were imprisoned and killed by Sadat, were outspoken in their criticism, but they were in Iran, and that made a lot of difference. Khomeini was free to say anything without going to Evin prison. Many of the Ayatollahs who stayed in the country were critical, and the Friday sermons by not the Imam Joma, because he was a government selected leader, but many of the others were consistently critical of the government, and the government knew it, and tried various means to diffuse this and divert it and dilute it, while all the time the mullahs were organizing at a different level of criticism, and that might characterize the whole country. You asked earlier about the National Front people. Most of those were middle-class intellectuals. It isn't fair to compare them to the supporters of Kerensky because things were different, but they tended to be armchair critics, those who would not risk their lives. And as often happens, they were passed on the left. That is, they were passed politically by those who were willing to give up their lives and use violence to achieve their political ends, because they were not basically willing to use violence. They were a more intellectualized middle class, nonetheless very talented group of people in many dimensions, who, ironically, were infected by an idea of political liberty by the West, and in many cases by the United States. There was an era when the children of the middle class went to France, or in some cases to England, to a certain extent to Germany for education. And they came back, graduates of Columbia and New York University and University of Utah and so forth. And they came back and said, gee, political freedom's a great idea, let's have it here. But very few of them were willing to risk their lives. People who were willing to risk their lives were the Mujahideen Khalq and several of the other groups, the pure religious groups, the Marxist religious groups, perhaps characterized by Khamenei, or who was the fellow who was in Hamburg, Beheshti, who, that may not be a conclusion, he was a very crafty politician, a man of great talent and wit and brains and guile. But there were...
Did you know him? Or?
No, I never met him. A very impressive man. The Mujahideen certainly knew who they were going after when they killed him. But those who were willing to risk their lives and go up to see a call and up in the mountains and train and learn how to use weapons and had aliases and safe houses and went abroad for training and carried Khomeini's tapes back into the country and spoke in the catacombs. It's almost like the early Christian era in a sense. They were illegal and their activities were illegal and they knew it. But they assassinated government officials, they assassinated Americans, they organized, they trained themselves, they used arms, weapons, explosives, aliases, safe houses, the whole panoply of underground activity, which then, of course, carried on into the Mullah era when the Mujahideen split with the Mullah. But these were the people who passed the national fronters because they were willing to do, not just to say.
I've read, this has been suggested by various writers, that to a great extent the CIA was dependent upon Sadat for information on the guerrilla organizations. How true is that?
Moderately so. Dependent on, I guess that's the thing I have trouble with. If you depended on Sadat to know anything about the country, you were in trouble. Because, think a minute, why would Sadat tell any foreign government, let alone the U.S. government, which was so much involved in supporting the Shah's government, that they had a critical problem with terrorists?